What happens when the one royal who has always stood firm, silent, and loyal finally speaks, and speaks with fire? That's exactly what the world woke up to when Princess and the woman long described as the monarchy's unshakable backbone unleashed a statement so raw, so pointed, that it didn't just ripple through the palace walls. It exploded across the entire United Kingdom. They abandoned the crown, she declared with chilling finality. So the crown abandons them. Let that sink in. These are not words whispered behind closed doors. These were public, measured, calculated, delivered with the weight of centuries of tradition. And instantly, they changed everything. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Can you imagine the silence that followed when those words hit the morning headlines? Think of the millions sipping tea, scrolling their phones, and suddenly freezing as they read the quote. Think of the broadcasters scrambling to adjust their scripts. Think of Harry and Meghan, half a world away, jolted awake by messages piling into their phones. For a moment, the world felt suspended in shock. This wasn't Charles hedging his words with royal politeness. This wasn't William cloaking his anger with diplomacy. This was Anne, the no-nonsense sister, the woman who never sought headlines, stepping forward to say what many inside the palace had whispered for years. Now, here's the question for you. Why now? Why did Anne, of all people, choose this moment to step into the storm? She's not known for theatrics. She isn't a royal who plays the media game. And yet here she was, planting her words like a sword into the ground. Was it an act of defense? A warning shot? Or was it something far more personal? A breaking point reached after years of watching the crown endure insult after insult? That's the mystery we're here to unravel. And trust me, the deeper we go, the sharper the revelations become. Let's step back for a second. For years, Anne has been described as the workhorse royal, the one who clocked in more engagements than her younger brothers combined, the one who didn't chase glamour but kept the machine of monarchy running in quiet, relentless rhythm. She has been the one constant while others faltered. So when she says, "Those who walk away from duty cannot expect to benefit from it," it isn't just a line, it's the essence of her life. It's her entire philosophy condensed into one brutal sentence. And make no mistake, it was aimed like an arrow at Harry and Meghan. But here's where the story twists. Did you know that inside the palace walls, Anne had reportedly warned Charles long before the Oprah interview, long before the Netflix documentaries, that the Sussex exit would come at a price? That by allowing Harry and Meghan to cherry-pick duties while still clutching titles and privileges, the crown was setting itself up for collapse? Imagine her frustration as she watched Charles hesitate, William strategize, and courtiers debate, while she saw the danger as clear as day, and has always believed in consequences. And now, in this single statement, she pulled the trigger. Yet the question lingers. Was this really her choice? Or was, and speaking what Charles himself couldn't bring himself to say? Some insiders whisper that the king gave his silent blessing, allowing Anne to act as the family's blunt instrument, knowing her reputation for honesty would lend the words more weight. Think about that. If true, then Anne wasn't just venting. She was executing a strategy, cutting off Harry and Meghan not just from inheritance, but from the very fabric of monarchy itself. That's not just a soundbite. That's a death sentence for their royal future. And how did the public react? Like wildfire. Social media lit up with hashtags celebrating Anne as the last true royal. Tabloids splashed her words across front pages in massive type. Talk shows debated whether this was the end of any reconciliation. But while Britain buzzed, Harry and Meghan's camp reportedly spiraled into chaos. Imagine Meghan's fury, being told that the inheritance they thought was safeguarded had been slashed away in one night. Imagine Harry, caught between love for his wife and the sting of rejection from his blood. That's not just family drama. That's legacy imploding in real time. Now, pause with me here. Do you think Anne was cruel or courageous? Is it heartless to slam the door on your own nephew? Or is it the only way to protect the crown? Because here's the contradiction at the heart of this story. Anne's words sounded merciless, yet many argue they were born out of loyalty. To her mother's memory, to her brother's reign, and to the institution she has served without complaint for decades. In a world where royals often speak in riddles, she spoke with clarity. And clarity cuts the deepest. But here's where things get darker. While the public statement shocked the world, whispers from insiders claim that Anne's private comments were even more devastating. Sources say that in confidential meetings, she pushed not just to cut off inheritance, but to strip Harry and Meghan of ceremonial titles altogether. Can you picture the reaction if that became public? The backlash, the lawsuits, the international uproar? It makes you wonder, was her public statement merely the tip of the iceberg, an iceberg whose full scale could sink Harry and Meghan's royal connection forever? As we dive into the details of what Anne said and what she didn't say, one thing becomes undeniable. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about drawing a line in the sand. And wanted to make it clear that the monarchy is not a club you can leave and rejoin at will. It's a life sentence, a contract sealed in blood and tradition. Break it, and you're out. No exceptions. No second chances. And perhaps, no mercy. But here's the twist you didn't see coming. And may not have been acting alone. Rumors swirl that William quietly backed her, feeding his aunt the resolve she needed to speak publicly. If true, this wasn't just Anne's voice. It was a chorus of royals finally saying what had been simmering in private for years. Imagine the calculation. Charles couldn't say it without appearing heartless. William couldn't say it without deepening the brotherly rift. But Anne could say it, and it would be accepted as truth, not cruelty. That's power. That's strategy. And it's brilliant in its ruthlessness. And yet, there's still one more layer. Because while the UK applauded Anne's courage, international voices painted a different picture. In America, Meghan's defenders accused Anne of cruelty, of hypocrisy, of clinging to outdated notions of monarchy. Hollywood figures rallied to Meghan's side, framing her as a woman targeted by an ancient system afraid of change. So, the war of perception ignited again, Britain hailing and as a hero, America casting her as a villain. And at the center of it all, two royals, Harry and Meghan, suddenly stripped of a future they thought was theirs by right. So where does this leave us? On one hand, Anne's words might be remembered as the statement that preserved the monarchy's strength. On the other, it may go down as the final nail in the coffin of reconciliation. And if you think this was the climax, you're mistaken. Because while Anne's words hit like thunder, the storm that followed was even more dramatic, more personal, and far more dangerous than anyone expected. And here's where we leave you for now. With the image of Anne, calm, unflinching, delivering her verdict to a stunned nation. But what happened behind closed doors, in the days before her statement went public, reveals an even harsher truth. Secrets were shared, tempers flared, and the final decision was not made lightly. In fact, what unfolded inside the palace was so explosive, it nearly tore the royal family apart from within. That's where we're heading next. Because the day the statement dropped wasn't the beginning. It was the end of a long, bitter road that started in whispers and ended in war. And when you hear what was said in that secret palace meeting, you'll understand why Anne's words landed with the force of a hammer. The day the statement dropped felt like Britain had woken up to a cold slap across the face. It wasn't gradual, it wasn't hinted at, it was sudden, loud, and undeniable. Imagine rolling out of bed, switching on the morning news, and seeing those 7 words printed in stark black across the bottom of the screen. They abandoned the crown, so the crown abandons them. Not whispered, not leaked. Official, princess, and had spoken, and in that moment, silence swept through homes, cafes, offices, and newsrooms across the country. You could almost hear the collective gasp. It was one of those mornings where time seemed to slow. Commuters froze with their coffees halfway to their lips. Parents stopped in the middle of making school lunches. Broadcasters scrambled, shuffling papers on live TV, repeating the line with disbelief as if hearing it again might make it less brutal. But it didn't. The words stayed sharp. They sliced through the carefully cultivated politeness the monarchy is known for. And it wasn't coming from Charles, the reigning king. It wasn't William, the heir. It wasn't a faceless spokesperson. It was Anne, the no-nonsense princess royal, speaking without filters, without hesitation, and without apology. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you heard a royal statement that sounded more like a battle cry than a diplomatic message? That morning wasn't about formality. It was about finality. Anne delivered it with the weight of someone who had carried the monarchy on her back for decades. This wasn't just a headline. It was a verdict. A sentence handed down not in court, but in the court of history. And the accused? Harry and Meghan. Now, picture the ripple effect. News anchors tried to soften it. Commentators tried to contextualize it, but no one could dull the sting. Radio hosts debated it. Taxi drivers discussed it with their passengers. In pubs, even before lunchtime, men and women leaned across tables, whispering about whether this was the end of any hope of reconciliation. It wasn't just gossip. It felt like a moment where the crown itself drew a line in the sand. And Anne? She was the one holding the stick. But here's the question. Why that day? Why that statement? Timing, in the royal world, is everything. Nothing is ever said without careful calculation. Some pointed out that it came just weeks before a major royal event, when public attention was already heightened. Others speculated it was a preemptive strike, cutting off Harry and Meghan before they could make yet another explosive revelation. Whatever the reason, the timing only made it more dramatic. It felt like the monarchy had finally reached its boiling point. And let's not forget the public. In Britain, many saw it as vindication. For years, people had muttered under their breath, asking why Harry and Meghan still held on to titles and privileges while living abroad, making millions, and seemingly mocking the very institution they'd abandoned. Anne's words, blunt and stripped of any sugarcoating, gave voice to what many had been saying in private. She said it out loud. And once spoken, there was no taking it back. Now, let's turn the lens across the Atlantic. In America, the reaction was different. Meghan's supporters cried foul, calling and statement heartless, branding it as proof of the monarchy's cold, rigid nature. Commentators on U.S. talk shows framed it as bullying, painting Meghan as a victim of an outdated system. Two countries, two perspectives, and at the center of it, one family ripped apart by a single sentence. But while the public wrestled with their opinions, imagine the silence in Montecito. Imagine Harry and Meghan being woken up by calls from aides and texts from friends, and just destroyed you in public. Imagine the looks on their faces, the frantic rush to control the narrative. Meghan, furious, pacing, already thinking of statements, interviews, and legal options. Harry, torn, angry, and silent, perhaps knowing deep down that Anne's words weren't just an opinion. They were an irrevocable decision. For the first time, it wasn't speculation. It wasn't gossip. It was official. And here's the part that makes it even more chilling. Insiders claim that the statement had been drafted days before, but held back until Anne herself approved the exact phrasing. She insisted on it being short, direct, no wiggle room. They abandoned the crown, so the crown abandons them. 12 words. 12 words that carried more power than any 12-page speech. That's in style. Efficient. Relentless. Final. But behind the polished delivery, something darker was brewing. Because, according to sources close to the palace, this wasn't the first time Anne had voiced this opinion. No, she had been warning about this very moment for years. And when the rest of the family hesitated, when Charles wavered and William strategized and sharpened her stance, by the time the statement went public, she wasn't just reacting. She was executing a plan that had been building quietly, brick by brick, over months, maybe even years. So, let me ask you directly, was this courage or cruelty? Was Anne defending the monarchy's dignity, or was she abandoning family in its darkest moment? Because here's the contradiction. The woman known as the most loyal, most duty-driven royal just took the most ruthless step imaginable. And in doing so, she might have saved the crown, or doomed it to look colder than ever before. But here's the part no one expected. The day the statement dropped wasn't the day the decision was made. Oh no, that decision had been sealed long before, in rooms far away from cameras and microphones. And if you thought Anne's public words were shocking, wait until you hear what happened behind those closed doors. Because before the statement ever saw the light of day, there was a secret meeting. A confrontation so fierce it left even Charles rattled. And what Anne said in that room makes her public declaration look like a gentle warning. The day the statement dropped was only the surface. The storm underneath was brewing for months. And in that storm, secrets were revealed that the palace never intended for the public to hear. What really happened when Anne sat down with Charles, William, and Camilla in that private meeting? What words were exchanged that finally tipped the scales towards such a brutal announcement? That's the story we're diving into next. Because if the public statement shook Britain, What happened in private nearly shook the monarchy to its very foundations. And trust me, you'll want to hear every detail of it. Why did Anne's words land like a thunderclap? Because they didn't come from just anyone. They came from the one royal who has never flinched, never courted the cameras, and never compromised on duty. Princess Anne, the so-called unshakable royal. That reputation didn't appear overnight. It was carved, piece by piece, out of decades of hard work, quiet resilience, and an unrelenting commitment to the institution she was born into. And when she finally broke her silence to unleash those 12 deadly words, the impact was magnified by the sheer weight of her record. If anyone had the right to pass judgment, it was her. Let's rewind. Think back to the younger years of Anne, living in the shadow of her mother, the late Queen Elizabeth II, and her older brother Charles. Unlike others who flirted with glamour and sometimes stumbled under the spotlight, and quickly became known for her no-nonsense style, she wasn't flashy. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't the type to run to the press with grievances. Instead, she put her head down and worked. Year after year, engagement after engagement, and clocked numbers that outstripped her siblings by thousands. She earned her reputation the hard way, through consistency, loyalty, and sheer grit. Now ask yourself, doesn't that make her words sting even more for Harry and Meghan? It wasn't coming from someone whose own record could be questioned. It wasn't a case of the pot calling the kettle black. This was Anne, who spent her entire life proving her loyalty, calling out two royals who, in her eyes, had walked away the second duty became inconvenient. That's the sting. That's why Britain listened. That's why people paused before they judged her harshly. Because when Anne speaks, it's not from a place of hypocrisy. It's from a place of lived experience. But here's where the irony creeps in. And has always been the most private of the senior royals, yet her bluntness has occasionally made headlines. Do you remember the time she famously brushed off photographers with a sharp knife off? Or when she appeared visibly unimpressed by Donald Trump during his state visit? She doesn't play games. She doesn't sugarcoat. She tells it as she sees it, and that directness is exactly what made her statement on Harry and Meghan so powerful. It wasn't dressed up in palace speak. It wasn't wrapped in flowery words. It was cold steel, delivered with surgical precision. But let's dig deeper. Anne's unshakable reputation is not just about her work ethic. It's about her philosophy. While Charles struggled with personal scandals, while Andrew drowned in disgrace, while Harry became the rebel and remained constant. No scandals, no whining, no attempts to monetize her royal status. Even her personal life, her divorce, her remarriage, was handled with minimal fuss. She set the example of how a royal could live privately while still serving publicly. That's why people admire her. That's why people trust her. And that's why her words carried the weight of Judgment Day. Now here's the twist. For years, Anne was seen as sympathetic toward Harry. Insiders say she always had a soft spot for him. The mischievous boy who never quite fit the mold. She reportedly saw echoes of herself in his rebellion, his unwillingness to conform. So why, then, did she turn so decisively against him now? That's the contradiction that shocks people most. Was it betrayal? Disappointment? Or was it that she expected more from him precisely because she saw herself in him? Think about that. Sometimes the harshest judgment comes not from enemies, but from those who once believed in you. Let's paint a picture of Anne's public life. She's often spotted in the same practical outfits, re-wearing coats for decades, recycling her wardrobe long before sustainability became fashionable. She drives herself to events. She walks briskly, speaks briefly, works efficiently. There's no vanity, no flash, no obsession with image. Contrast that with Meghan's Hollywood glamour, with designer gowns and curated Netflix moments. The difference is stark, and it makes Anne's statement feel like more than a rebuke. It feels like a cultural clash, a reminder that the monarchy, at least in her eyes, isn't about celebrity. It's about sacrifice. Here's a question for you. If Anne had lived Meghan's life for even 1 month, would she have survived it? And if Meghan had lived Anne's life, would she have endured it? The answer reveals why these two women stand on opposite sides of a royal chasm. Anne thrives on anonymity and service. Meghan thrives on visibility and influence. Put them in the same room, and sparks were always destined to fly. And what about Harry? Remember, Anne is not just his aunt. She is also his godmother in the sense of duty. She exemplifies everything the monarchy expected of him. That's why her disappointment cuts deeper than Charles's scolding or William's frustration. When and says, "You abandoned the crown," it's not just a line, it's a personal betrayal. To her, Harry didn't just walk away from titles. He walked away from the very ethos she has spent her entire life defending. Imagine being Harry, reading those words, knowing they came from the one royal who never bends, never bluffs, never exaggerates. That's not just criticism. That's a final verdict. And here's the part that really shocks royal watchers. Insiders suggest that, and had been warning the family for years about the dangers of indulging Harry and Meghan. She had seen what was coming long before anyone else. She reportedly told Charles, bluntly, that you cannot have half-royals. You cannot allow someone to keep the privileges without the responsibilities. But her warnings were ignored, brushed aside as too harsh. Now, years later, her words have proven prophetic. And when she finally stepped into the spotlight to deliver her damning line, it wasn't spontaneous. It was the culmination of years of frustration. So, where does that leave her reputation now? Stronger than ever, among loyalists, and has become almost mythic. The Iron Princess, the voice of truth. For those who support Harry and Meghan, she is the cold enforcer of a cruel system. But no matter where you stand, one fact is undeniable. She is consistent. She has always lived by the principle of duty above all, and she expects the same from others. That consistency is why her words cannot be dismissed. They are not the ramblings of a bitter relative. They are the creed of someone who has walked the walk for over 70 years. And yet, despite her reputation for strength, there is a softer undercurrent that few talk about. Those who know and say she feels things deeply, but she hides it beneath her iron exterior. Which raises another question. Did her statement come from cold duty or from heartbreak? Could it be that beneath her sharp words lies a deep sadness, a mourning for the nephew she once cherished, the boy who laughed beside her at Balmoral, the child she believed would grow into a man of service? And now, watching him trade duty for dollars, she feels not just anger, but grief. That's the complexity of Anne. She is both unshakable and deeply human, both stern and quietly compassionate. And it is in that contradiction that her power lies. When she speaks, you feel both the weight of the crown and the ache of family. That's why Britain listens. That's why the world pays attention. And that's why her words that day were more than a statement. They were a reckoning. But if you think her public image is the only reason her words landed with such force, think again. Because what many don't realize is that Anne's rebuke didn't just come from her sense of duty. It came from a very specific event that left her furious with Harry and Meghan, an incident that unfolded just months before her statement went public. And when you hear what happened, you'll understand why the unshakable royal finally snapped. It all began with promises. Promises Harry and Meghan made not just to the Queen, not just to the institution, but to the British people. Do you remember those carefully worded lines when they first stepped back in 2020? They insisted they would honor their duty to the Queen, that they would support Her Majesty from abroad, that they were leaving to seek financial independence, but would never abandon service. On paper, it sounded respectful. It sounded measured. It sounded like they wanted to keep one foot inside the palace door even as they boarded a plane to California. But promises are only as strong as the actions that follow them. And what followed, for many, including Princess and felt like betrayal. Let's start with the most obvious contradiction, financial independence. Within months of their departure, Harry and Meghan signed multi-million-dollar deals with Netflix and Spotify. Deals that didn't just raise eyebrows, but sparked outrage. Why? Because they weren't selling fictional stories. They were selling the crown, selling royal connections, selling the very identity they claimed they wanted to step away from. Think about it. Would Netflix have thrown hundreds of millions at two ordinary celebrities? Or was it the royal brand, built over centuries, that carried the value? And if that's the case, how independent were they really? Now imagine being Princess Anne, a woman who has spent her entire life refusing to cash in on her position, who recycles her clothes, drives her own car, and quietly works hundreds of engagements every year. Watching her nephew transform his crown into content, how could she see it as anything other than exploitation? And then came the interviews. The one that shook the monarchy most was, of course, Oprah. Harry and Meghan sat under a California sun and launched accusations that reverberated across the globe. Racism, neglect, mental health struggles ignored. To their fans, it was brave truth-telling. To their critics, it was betrayal on a grand scale. And for Anne, it was unforgivable. She had lived through criticism, through scandals, through attacks on the monarchy before, but never had a member of the family gone on primetime television to air grievances to millions. To her, it wasn't courage, it was cowardice. Ask yourself this. When Harry said his family had cut him off financially, was it truth? Or a strategic narrative to build sympathy? Because reports later showed that Charles had, in fact, provided financial support during their transition. The contradiction between their words and the evidence only deepened Anne's disdain. To her, a broken promise wasn't just dishonor, it was deception. And what about the Queen? Remember their pledge to support Her Majesty from abroad? Less than 2 years later, Harry and Meghan were releasing a docuseries that many felt was an indirect attack on the very monarchy she represented. Netflix trailers splashed images of Princess Diana's funeral to frame Harry's narrative of victimhood. Old photographs of the Queen appeared juxtaposed with Meghan's emotional retellings. Whether intentional or not, the optics painted the monarchy as cruel, outdated, and heartless. Did that look like support? Did that look like honoring the Queen? To Anne, it looked like betrayal packaged for streaming. But here's where it gets even more personal. When Prince Philip, Anne's father and Harry's grandfather, was hospitalized, Meghan and Harry's team released a statement doubling down on their criticisms of the monarchy. For the royal family, that timing was beyond offensive. For Anne, it was deeply disrespectful. While she sat at her father's bedside, watching him fight for his final days, Harry and Meghan were on the offensive in California. Can you imagine the fury? Can you picture Anne's face as she read headlines attacking the monarchy while she mourned privately? For her, that wasn't just a broken promise. It was a betrayal of family in their darkest hour. And it didn't end there. Harry's memoir, Spare, drove the knife even deeper. He recounted private family moments, painted Charles as cold, Camilla as manipulative, William as aggressive. He laid bare intimate conversations no royal had ever dared to share. To fans, it was honesty. To Anne, it was sacrilege. Royals live by the code of silence. They endure attacks, but never respond in kind. Harry ripped that code apart. And in doing so, he tore away the very fabric that Anne had spent her entire life protecting. Now pause for a moment. Imagine you are Anne. You have worked thousands of engagements without complaint. You have lived under constant scrutiny, but never sought pity. You have endured personal pain privately while upholding public duty. And then you watch Harry, your nephew, cashing in on stories of privilege, turning family scars into revenue streams. Would you see it as independence? Or exploitation? Would you see it as bravery? Or as broken promises dressed up as virtue? That's why Anne's statement cut so deeply. It wasn't just a reaction to one event. It was the culmination of years of disappointment. Every time Harry and Meghan promised loyalty but delivered betrayal, every time they spoke of service but showcased self-interest, Anne's patience wore thinner. And by the time she said, "They abandoned the crown, so the crown abandons them," she wasn't just speaking of one betrayal. She was summing up a pattern. But here's where the story turns darker. There was one moment, one promise in particular, that Anne considered the ultimate betrayal. It didn't play out on television screens or in glossy books. It happened in private, in the lead-up to a major royal event. And when Harry and Meghan broke their word that time, it was the final straw for Anne. The betrayal was so personal, so raw, that from that point on, she vowed never to defend them again. And what was that broken promise? What happened behind the scenes that left Anne so furious she eventually pushed to sever their inheritance altogether? That's where our story is heading. Because the truth about that private promise and the fallout it caused makes Anne's public statement look like only the surface of her true anger. Imagine the scene. A private room in Buckingham Palace, doors shut tight, curtains drawn, guards stationed outside. No cameras, no microphones, just the raw voices of the royals echoing against the walls. This was no ordinary gathering. This was the meeting where Princess Anne, after years of restraint, finally erupted. And it was in this meeting, insiders whisper, that the seeds of her now famous public statement were planted. The tension was so thick, you could almost slice it with a knife. Charles sat at the head of the table, shoulders heavy, the crown already weighing on him in ways few could understand. William leaned forward, jaw clenched, a storm of frustration building behind his carefully measured words. Camilla, poised, cautious, her eyes darting between them like a chess player calculating her next move. And then there was Anne, rigid, resolute, her gaze sharp as steel. She wasn't there to play politics. She wasn't there to cushion blows. She was there to deliver a reckoning. The meeting began with formality. Papers shuffled, financial reports passed across the table, talk of inheritance, trust funds, and ceremonial privileges. But it didn't stay formal for long. Because the moment Harry and Meghan's names surfaced, the air changed. It grew colder. The silence stretched longer. And finally, Anne slammed her hand flat against the polished table. The sound rang out like a gunshot. Everyone froze. And then, in that trademark blunt tone, she unleashed the words that had been simmering in her for years. This cannot go on. They abandoned the crown, so the crown abandons them. Now imagine Charles's face. His sister, the one who rarely speaks in meetings, had just declared war on his son. William, though, didn't flinch. He nodded, ever so slightly, as if and had spoken the words he had been biting back. Camilla's lips tightened, her silence louder than words. The room crackled with unspoken truths. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about betrayal. It was about loyalty. It was about the very survival of the monarchy. But here's the question you should ask yourself. Why was this meeting happening now? Why, after years of silence, did the royals suddenly decide to confront the Sussex question head-on? Because something had happened. Something behind the scenes that had pushed even Charles, who had clung to the hope of reconciliation, into a corner. Reports suggest that a major donor had pulled out of a royal trust, citing concerns over the Sussexes' controversies. Others whispered that confidential palace documents, tied to finances, had surfaced in Meghan's Netflix pitch meetings. Whether true or not, the mere suspicion was enough to shake the palace to its core. And Anne, who had been warning for years, finally said enough. In that meeting, her words weren't just sharp, they were surgical. She listed, point by point, the promises Harry and Meghan had broken. She reminded them of the disgrace Harry brought when he revealed intimate family secrets in Spare. She recounted Meghan's carefully staged media campaigns, her attacks dressed as confessions. And then she turned to Charles directly. Her voice was steady, her words cutting. You let this go on because he is your son. But you are not just a father. You are the king. And the king cannot afford sentiment. Imagine that. A sister telling her brother to put aside fatherhood for monarchy. The weight of that demand is almost unbearable. And yet, in that room, it carried truth. For Charles, the conflict was excruciating. He loved his son, but he also knew the monarchy could not withstand endless scandal. And in that moment, Anne's voice became not just the voice of a sister. It became the voice of survival. William spoke next, and his words only added fuel to the fire. According to insiders, he admitted that he no longer saw a path back for Harry. That too much damage had been done. That trust had been shredded beyond repair. And, hearing this, pressed harder. She argued that by keeping Harry and Meghan on the books, financially, ceremonially, symbolically, they were sending a message of weakness. That royals could leave, profit, and still return whenever convenient. She demanded the monarchy make an example. And in her words, the solution was clear. Strip the privileges, cut the ties, cancel the inheritance. Now let's pause here. Can you imagine the weight of that moment? A family sitting together, debating whether to erase their own flesh and blood from the future of the crown. The silence after Anne's outburst must have felt endless. You can almost see Charles rubbing his temples, torn between his heart and his duty. You can picture William, silent but resolute, ready to take the hard road. You can sense Camilla's quiet calculations, knowing every decision here would shape not just their reign, but their legacy. And then Anne dropped the final blow. She reminded them of the Queen. She said, Mummy would never have tolerated this. She believed in duty. She believed in sacrifice. And she would have cut them off the day they walked away. The room went still. Bringing the Queen into it was no small thing. It was invoking the memory of the woman who had defined monarchy for 7 decades. It was a moral hammer, and Anne swung it with precision. What could Charles say to that? How could he argue against the memory of his mother? against the logic that the monarchy itself was at stake? He couldn't. And so, though he didn't speak immediately, though the silence hung heavy, something shifted in that room. For the first time, the king himself began to lean toward Anne's side. And that was the turning point. But here's the twist. While the palace meeting ended with Anne's words ringing in everyone's ears, the real story is what happened after. Sources say the royals didn't all walk out united. Far from it. There were tears. There were raised voices. And at least one person stormed out, furious at what they saw as betrayal of family. That person, insiders claim, wasn't Charles or William. It wasn't Camilla. Which leaves only one conclusion. Another royal, perhaps Edward, perhaps someone unexpected, was deeply shaken by Anne's demand. So ask yourself, was this meeting truly about protecting the monarchy? Or was it about vengeance? Was Anne fighting for the institution, or for her own sense of betrayed loyalty? The truth may be both. And it was in this storm of family conflict that the decision was sealed. By the time Anne's words became public weeks later, the groundwork had already been laid in that room. The crown had chosen survival over sentiment. And Harry and Meghan had been abandoned long before the world knew it. But here's the question that keeps royal insiders awake at night. Was that decision final? Or was it the first domino in a chain reaction that could tear the monarchy apart from within? Because while Anne had spoken her truth, the fallout had only just begun. And the next chapter in this saga reveals exactly what the royals meant when they said the Sussexes' inheritance was cancelled, not just in money, but in legacy. And that revelation is even more brutal than Anne's public words. What exactly did Anne mean by inheritance? Was it just money? Was it titles? Was it ceremonial privileges? Or was it something deeper, something far more permanent? An erasure from the royal legacy itself? That's the question Britain asked the moment her statement hit the headlines. And the truth, as it turns out, is harsher than anyone expected. Inheritance in the royal family isn't like the inheritance you or I think of. It isn't just about splitting up bank accounts and heirlooms. It's about access. It's about trust funds, estates, ceremonial roles, and positions in the line of succession. It's about the unspoken privileges that come with being tied to the crown. And when Anne declared that Harry and Meghan had abandoned it, she wasn't speaking metaphorically. She was pointing to the very real dismantling of everything they once thought was secured for them and for their children. Let's begin with the financials. For generations, members of the royal family have benefited from various trusts established by monarchs long gone. The Duchy of Lancaster, the Duchy of Cornwall, private family trusts created for grandchildren and great-grandchildren of monarchs. Harry, as the son of a king, was set to inherit not just ceremonial titles, but also financial security tied to centuries of planning. But when Anne pushed to sever his inheritance, she was effectively calling for those funds to bypass him entirely. Instead of falling into Harry's hands, or Archie and Lilibet's, they would be redistributed to working royals. In other words, the crown would invest only in those who invested in it. Imagine the sting. Harry had once been assured, as the younger son, that he might not inherit the throne, but he would never want for stability. And suddenly, that safety net was yanked away. Years of privilege, erased with a single decision. That's not just financial loss, it's symbolic exile. Now let's talk about titles. In the world of royalty, titles are currency. Duke, Duchess, Prince, Princess, they aren't just decorative words. They carry weight. They grant access to ceremonial events, to state occasions, to military associations, to charity patronages. But Anne's demand that inheritance be cut meant more than cutting off cash. It meant stripping those titles of their value. It meant rendering them hollow. Imagine Archie and Lilibet growing up with royal titles, but no royal privileges. Imagine them excluded from official invitations, omitted from ceremonial roles. That is the true weight of inheritance cancelled. And then there are the estates. The royal family doesn't just own castles and palaces. It controls vast stretches of land, homes passed down for generations. Harry once had the right to call Frogmore Cottage his home in Britain. That was revoked. Reports suggest that other estates, which might once have been earmarked for him or his children, are now being redirected. Instead of Archie and Lilibet inheriting a slice of Britain's grandest history, the doors are closed, locked, sealed, and the keys handed elsewhere. But here's where it gets darker. Inheritance is also about legacy. about how history remembers you, about which names are inscribed on plaques, which portraits hang in palaces, which stories get retold. And Anne's words suggested something far more chilling than financial or ceremonial exile. They suggested erasure, that Harry and Meghan's names, their children's names, could be written out of the story of the monarchy altogether. That future generations of royals would walk past gilded portraits in Buckingham Palace and never see them represented. That their chapter would be remembered not as a contribution, but as a cautionary tale. Pause for a moment and think about that. For Harry, a man raised in the shadow of Diana's memory, legacy is everything. His mother is immortalized in bronze statues, documentaries, charity work, tributes at every royal milestone. And yet, his own children could grow up with their legacy deliberately erased. Can you imagine the anguish? Can you imagine the rage? That's what Anne meant when she said the crown abandons them. Not just rejection, oblivion. And it doesn't stop there. Cutting off inheritance also means cutting off symbolic roles. Remember the military associations Harry once cherished? Captain General of the Royal Marines, honorary air commandant, gone. Stripped. And with Anne's demand, the possibility of passing down any ceremonial honor to Archie or Lilibet vanished too. No honorary colonelcies. No royal patronages. No symbolic connections to the armed forces that had defined Harry's identity. Instead, those roles will pass to other royals, William's children, Edward's children, perhaps even Anne's grandchildren. So, was Anne's move about money? No, it was about drawing a line. A brutal, definitive line that said, the monarchy will not invest in those who walk away. The privileges of inheritance, the honor of legacy, the symbolism of titles, those are rewards for loyalty, not bargaining chips for ex-royals living in California mansions. That was the message. And in many ways, it was Anne's way of safeguarding the monarchy's future. But here's where the twist comes in. While Anne was making her case for inheritance to be cancelled, another voice in that secret meeting argued that cutting Harry off completely could backfire. That by pushing him further away, the monarchy risked turning him into a global martyr, a Diana-like figure of victimhood. The debate was fierce. Should the crown slam the door shut or leave it slightly ajar? Anne was clear. Shut it, lock it, and throw away the key. And her public statement proved that. In the end, her view won. But was it the right decision? That's the question. Because while Britain celebrated Anne's bluntness, America rallied around Meghan and Harry. Hollywood doubled down on its support. The Sussexes' allies framed the move as cruelty, as proof of the monarchy's icy heart. And far from silencing Harry and Meghan, the decision to cut their inheritance may have fueled their next moves. Think about it. What do people with nothing left to lose usually do? They fight back. Harder, louder, and more recklessly. So what comes next? What happens when inheritance is cancelled but the hunger for relevance remains? When the door is closed but the cameras are still rolling? That's where the story takes a turn. Because Anne's words didn't just cut ties, they lit a fire. And in the weeks that followed, the reaction across the UK was nothing short of explosive. Newspapers went to war. Social media erupted. Politicians weighed in. And the battle lines between Britain and America grew sharper than ever before. Which brings us to the next chapter of this saga, the public reaction. How did Anne's words echo through the streets of London, through pub conversations, through headlines splashed across the tabloids? And what did ordinary Britons really think when one of their most loyal royals finally said out loud what many had whispered for years? The reaction across the United Kingdom was immediate, visceral, and unforgettable. When Anne's words exploded onto front pages and news tickers, they abandoned the crown, so the crown abandons them. Britain didn't just hear a statement. It heard a verdict. The streets buzzed with it. Pubs filled with heated debates. Radio call-in shows jammed with callers who could barely contain their emotions. It wasn't just a royal drama anymore. It was a national conversation. Picture the morning commute. On trains into London, you could see commuters clutching their newspapers, eyebrows raised, lips pursed in shock. The tabloids screamed the line in bold black ink, while broadsheets framed it in more dignified terms. The BBC tried to deliver it with balance, but even their presenters looked unsettled, as though they knew history had just shifted. And the Princess Royal had spoken words that no one dared to say so directly before, and the country could hardly process it. In working-class neighborhoods, people gathered around televisions in cafes and barbershops. Some cheered. About time someone said it. An elderly man told a Sky News reporter outside a Liverpool cafe. You don't get to spit on the family and still take from it. Others, though, shook their heads. It's too harsh. He's her nephew. That's Diana's boy. They should have found another way. Britain was divided, but one thing was clear, no one was indifferent. Now imagine the chatter online. Twitter lit up like fireworks. Hashtags trended. Hashtag team and hashtag royal reckoning. Hashtag abandoned by the crown. Memes spread within minutes. Some showing, and as a sword-wielding knight defending the monarchy, others mocking the coldness of her words. TikTokers reenacted the line dramatically, adding slow-motion effects and thunder sounds. Even Instagram flooded with edits of Anne. Her steely eyes contrasted with images of Harry and Meghan in California sunshine. It was everywhere, and it wasn't slowing down. But here's the deeper point. This wasn't just gossip. It tapped into something raw in the British psyche. The monarchy isn't just an institution. To many, it's a symbol of identity, of tradition, of continuity in uncertain times. And when Harry and Meghan left, many Brits quietly felt abandoned themselves. They felt mocked by the very people they once cheered for on wedding days and balcony appearances. Anne's words gave those quiet frustrations a voice. A voice that said, "We see it too. Enough is enough." Yet let's not oversimplify. Because for every Briton who nodded approvingly, another gasped in horror. Some saw Anne's statement as unnecessarily cruel, proof that the monarchy was rigid and outdated. It just makes them look heartless, a woman in Manchester told ITV. Families fight, but you don't cut your children out like this. This wasn't just about Harry and Meghan anymore. It was about what the monarchy stood for. Was it compassion? Or was it cold duty? The debate spread like wildfire, and suddenly, Anne wasn't just a royal aunt. She was the face of a nation's moral dilemma. The press played its part, of course. The Daily Mail hailed her as a hero, and speaks truth. The Guardian questioned her harshness. Where is the humanity? The Times analyzed it like a state decision, weighing constitutional implications. Meanwhile, talk radio went into overdrive. Callers shared stories of their own families, comparing Anne's words to disowning children, cutting ties with siblings, refusing to forgive. It became personal. Everyone had an opinion because everyone could relate to the pain of broken family ties. Even if the stage here was royal, the themes were universal. Now let's step into the pubs, because that's where the heart of Britain's conversation truly beats. In East London, regulars crowded around pints, voices rising with every retelling of the line. "She's a legend," one said, slamming his glass on the bar. "No nonsense, that one. Proper royal." But at another table, a young woman argued back. "Legend? It's heartless. They're human beings, not just pawns." Imagine Diana hearing this. She'd be horrified. The arguments stretched late into the night, laughter mixing with anger, as Anne's words sparked one of the fiercest debates Britain had seen about the royals since the Diana years. And here's where the irony lies. Anne, who never craves the spotlight, had suddenly become the epicenter of global attention. The most private, hard-working royal had accidentally created one of the most public storms in modern monarchy. Did she expect the reaction? Maybe. Did she care? Insiders suggest she didn't flinch. When aides informed her of the uproar, she reportedly shrugged and said, "They'll get over it." That's, and, practical, unshaken, unwilling to pander to sentiment. But the fallout didn't stop at public debate. It trickled into politics. MPs were asked in interviews if they agreed with Anne's words. Some dodged, some supported her, some criticized. It even reached Prime Minister's questions, where a backbencher quipped, "Perhaps Her Royal Highness is stricter than His Majesty." Laughter rippled through the chamber, but the message was clear. This was bigger than family drama. It was national discourse. And then came the polls. Within 48 hours, YouGov released data showing Anne's approval ratings had skyrocketed. She was suddenly the most respected working royal after William and Catherine. The public saw her as honest, dependable, and unwilling to play games. By contrast, Harry and Meghan's numbers plunged further. Even among younger Britons, sympathy waned. The tide had turned, and Anne's words were the catalyst. But here's the catch. Public opinion can be a double-edged sword. While Anne was being praised at home, the backlash abroad was fierce. American commentators painted her as cruel, the monarchy as cold and heartless. The divide between Britain and America widened, and that tension between a loyal home audience and a hostile overseas one would set the stage for Meghan's furious response. Because while Britain debated in pubs and parliaments, Meghan was plotting. She wasn't about to let Anne's words stand unchallenged. And what she unleashed next was just as explosive, an answer that made headlines of its own and reignited the war between Palace and California. If you thought Meghan was going to sit quietly while Anne's words ricocheted across the globe, you don't know Meghan. Silence has never been her strategy. From the moment Anne's statement hit the headlines, they abandoned the crown, so the crown abandons them. Her camp went into overdrive. Phones buzzed in Montecito. PR teams assembled. Advisors circled. Within hours, Meghan was pacing the halls of her California mansion, furious, her voice carrying down the corridors. For her, Anne's bluntness wasn't just a rebuke. It was a declaration of war. Now picture it. Meghan, phone in hand, furiously scrolling through headlines. The Daily Mail plastering Anne's face above words of steel. The Sun dubbing her Britain's Iron Princess. Social media hashtags like hashtag team and trending worldwide. And across the Atlantic, America watching closely, with commentators on The View and CNN questioning if and had gone too far. To Meghan, it wasn't just about reputation. It was about survival. If she let this moment pass unanswered, the narrative would harden against her. And so she did what she always does. She prepared to strike back. Her first move? The press. Insiders say Meghan's team immediately began drafting responses, testing which narrative would resonate best. Should she paint Anne as cruel and out of touch? Should she lean into the victim role, highlighting how unfairly she and Harry were treated? Or should she pivot, framing Anne's words as proof that the monarchy was afraid of her strength? Meghan loves a stage, and here was a global one, served to her on a silver platter. And strike she did. Within days, whispers began circulating in American outlets, Meghan's friends speaking anonymously, describing Anne's statement as heartless and vindictive. Articles appeared framing Meghan as the target of an outdated, patriarchal institution that couldn't tolerate strong women. One insider quoted in People magazine called Anne's words a betrayal not just of Meghan and Harry, but of Diana's legacy. You see the tactic? Meghan wasn't just defending herself. She was invoking Diana, the ultimate card in the royal narrative game. But Meghan didn't stop with whispers. She wanted her own voice out there. Cue the interviews. American talk shows reportedly reached out immediately, offering platforms for her to respond. While Meghan didn't appear instantly, her allies did. Gayle King hinted at Meghan's hurt. Oprah herself was said to be disappointed in the monarchy's cruelty. It was coordinated, strategic, and undeniably effective. In the U.S., sympathy began swinging back toward Meghan. She was the underdog again, the outsider crushed by the institution. Now let's pause. Doesn't this feel familiar? Every time the monarchy draws a line, Meghan reframes it as an attack on her personally. And every time, she spins that attack into fuel for her brand. This time was no different. Anne's words weren't just an insult. They were an opportunity. And Meghan knew exactly how to play it. Yet what makes this response fascinating is how personal it became. Sources close to Meghan claimed she was seething, not just at Anne's words, but at the source. To her, Anne wasn't just another royal. She was the embodiment of everything Meghan despised about the institution. Cold, traditional, unsentimental. The anti-Meghan, if you will. And the idea that Anne, who rarely even speaks publicly, would break her silence just to target her? That cut deep. Meghan reportedly told a confidant, "This was designed to destroy me." And what about Harry? His reaction was different. He was torn. Insiders suggest that while Meghan raged, Harry sat quietly, staring at the statement over and over, muttering under his breath. It was his aunt, after all. The woman who had once looked at him with warmth, who had stood beside him during family gatherings, who had embodied the stability he lacked. For her to speak so decisively against him, it broke something in him. And yet, caught between his wife's fury and his family's rejection, he chose silence. Meghan, as always, took the lead. But here's the contradiction. Meghan's response, though fiery, may have done her more harm than good. In Britain, her counterattack was seen as proof of her obsession with control. Commentators blasted her for weaponizing the American media. Headlines accused her of playing victim again. And the more she spoke, the more Anne's silence looked dignified. Meghan was furious, loud, emotional, and was calm, blunt, immovable. And in the court of public opinion, sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon. Still, Meghan had one more card to play. Insiders claim she threatened legal action, exploring whether Anne's words could be construed as defamation or interference with inheritance rights. Lawyers were consulted, letters drafted. But here's the catch. Anne's words were carefully chosen. They weren't accusations. They weren't claims. They were principles. And principles are hard to sue. Meghan's fury met Anne's stoicism, and for once, her legal machinery ground to a halt. Yet even in defeat, Meghan didn't retreat. She pivoted again, this time framing Anne's words as proof of her own strength. She began hinting at new projects, another documentary, a tell-all memoir from her perspective, exclusive interviews that would expose the real story. Her strategy was clear. If the monarchy slammed the door, she would build a bigger stage outside. And the more they pushed her out, the louder she would shout. But here's the twist. What Meghan didn't know was that Anne wasn't done. Because while Meghan fumed, raged, and plotted, and had receipts, letters, records, proof that Harry and Meghan had been warned long before, proof that their promises had been broken time and time again. And when those receipts surfaced, Meghan's furious response would look less like righteous indignation and more like desperation. For years, Princess Anne had been writing, quietly, carefully, letters penned not for the public eye, but for family. Direct, unembellished, unmistakably Anne. Unlike Charles, who often tried to soften his words, or William, who preferred face-to-face confrontations and chose paper. Perhaps it was her old-fashioned streak. Perhaps it was her need for clarity, because once ink touched paper, there was no denial, no misremembering. And those letters, insiders reveal, became the silent record of her growing disillusionment with Harry and Meghan. Imagine it. Stacks of cream-colored stationery, the royal crest embossed at the top. Anne's handwriting. Sharp, controlled, without flourish. Each letter a mixture of warning and plea. Each one echoing the values she had lived by all her life. Duty, sacrifice, loyalty. To her, these weren't just family values. They were survival codes. And yet, letter after letter went unanswered, ignored, or brushed off with hollow reassurances. That silence, more than anything, cut and to the core. The first letters were almost gentle. This was the period right after Harry and Meghan announced they were stepping back, and wrote urging caution, reminding Harry of the weight of what he was walking away from. You cannot half-serve, one line reportedly read. You either give everything, or you give nothing. And if you give nothing, the institution will give nothing back. It was advice, not threat. But beneath the words, you can feel Anne's clarity. She saw what others refused to see, that compromise would destroy the crown. Then came the second phase. When the Oprah interview aired, Anne's tone shifted. She wrote again, this time with unmistakable disappointment. Sources claim she scolded Harry directly for airing grievances in public. Our family has endured worse and remained silent, she reportedly wrote. Dignity in silence protects the whole. To Meghan, her words would have sounded archaic, even cruel. To Anne, they were truth carved from decades of experience. But here's the haunting part. By the time Harry released Spare, Anne's letters had hardened. They no longer read like advice. They read like ultimatums. One line, preserved in memory by those who saw it, stands out. If you continue to burn the house that sheltered you, don't expect to be welcomed at its table. Brutal, final, almost prophetic when compared to her later public statement. Now pause for a moment and think about this. What's more powerful, an angry television interview or a handwritten royal letter, preserved in the archives forever? Meghan could rally the media, Harry could pour his heart into a memoir, but Anne's words, quiet, permanent, ink on paper, would outlast them all. Letters become records. Records become history. And Anne knew it. That's why she wrote. To make sure the truth wasn't lost in the noise. But here's the twist. There was one final letter. The one insiders whisper about with hushed voices. The one that never made it into public view until now. Written months before her public statement, it was addressed directly to Harry, but Meghan's name appeared in it too. And it didn't just contain advice or disappointment. It contained a warning. If you and your wife persist, I will make sure the inheritance stops with you. Can you feel the weight of that? This wasn't an idle threat. This was Anne, the woman who rarely speaks, the woman whose words always match her actions, drawing a line. And true to her promise, she later carried it out. The public statement wasn't sudden. It was the fulfillment of a vow written in private long before. Imagine Meghan's fury if she saw that letter. Imagine Harry's heartbreak. For him, it wasn't just his aunt speaking. It was the royal system itself speaking through her. A system that, for once, didn't cloak itself in soft words but bared its teeth. And once those letters exist, they can't be denied. They are proof. They are receipts. And they show that Harry and Meghan weren't blindsided. They were warned. Now, here's the contradiction. For the public, Anne's statement sounded like cold steel. But for those who have seen the letters, it's clear she tried to prevent this outcome. She warned. She pleaded. She gave chances. And when those were thrown back in her face, she acted. In a way, the letters reveal something unexpected.